You have been interviewing white men affected by DEI.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. And they roll it out across our biggest companies and institutions around the world. But what they don't realise is
Trump put an executive order immediately.
You should be hired and promoted based on skill and competence, not race or gender.
what they're rolling out is this kind of cultural Marxist-inspired, ideologically driven program that's been bubbling away since the 70s. If you're white and male, you are an oppressor.
Our country should be more fearful of white men across our country.
And the effects that it have aren't good for men, they're not good for women, and they're not good for people of colour because they backfire.
Can you tell me about whiteness training?
Twice in this material, it uses the word.
Why was this ideology so successful?
An industry which is estimated to be around $14 billion a year.
Wait, so who's spending what money and who's getting it?
I found an NHS job that was being advertised for a DEI person, which paid up to £139,000 a year. When you overnight announce a quota, you're setting people up for failure.
Is there evidence that anti-racism training works?
Strongest evidence is 36% of guys under 34 are saying they've directly lost out on promotions or career opportunities because they're white and male. The knock-on effects of that is because it's saying to men, you can do or say the one wrong thing at work and you will lose everything.
Before you hear from Tim Samuels, I ask if you want to support this show. Remember, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Tim Samuels exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, not only will you get exclusive content, interviews and ad-free viewing, but you'll also have an extended conversation I had with Tim. But without further ado, Tim Samuels. Tim, thank you so much for coming to speak with me about your new show, White Men Can't Work.
Yep.
You have spent 20 years at the BBC. Where
In and out, yep.
In and out. You were an investigative correspondent for Newsnight. You won Young Journalist of the Year. You
Once
also
upon a time, yes.
a published author, Who Stole My Spirit, which I think touches on some of the issues we might be discussing today. And your new show has garnered you the honour of a hugely critical piece in The Guardian, which I assume is a badge of honour and means
I shall wear it with pride now, yeah.
all of which we're going to get into. The issue that is ruffling so many feathers is that of DEI. And I'm very keen to understand DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You have been interviewing people affected, obviously white men, predominantly white men, affected by DEI in Britain. Before we get into specific cases, I thought we might unpack what is DEI and where we're at with DEI right now. So I suppose the simple question is, what is DEI?
I mean, in its purest original form, it goes back to the 60s and John F. Kennedy coming to power into a world where there was segregation, Jim Crow laws still in effect, rampant racism and sexism in the workplace. And JFK took a look at this and said, this has got to change. And he used his federal power to force companies to bring in what we might call equal opportunities. And it wasn't that controversial at the time. And after he died, LBJ carried it on, and Richard Nixon too, as well. It wasn't a left-right issue at the time. And in fact, in some ways, the right were more into civil rights at the time than the Democrats because of sort of historical reasons. But what happens is it sort of goes away for a while and it reemerges more recently as diversity, equity and inclusion.
It was called affirmative action, right?
Yeah, so we had, it was equal opportunities, and then Reagan tries to sort of dismantle it, and along the way Nixon and people had brought in affirmative action, or essentially positive discrimination. And it's not seen as terribly controversial. Reagan has a go at trying to dismantle it. He says it's not needed, but the companies at the time all say, actually, no, we think this is important. We do think we need more workers from minority backgrounds, not least because the labour force, particularly in the States, you've got a lot of people from minority backgrounds. You need more workers. Companies also get massively sued in the late 90s, early 2000s, so hundreds of millions of fines. And Coca-Cola had a $192 million fine around their the makeup and not having kind of adequate racial protection in place. So all this kind of propels what we might think, when I guess I joined the workforce in the late 90s and 2000s as, quite sort of sensible, sane stuff. But what's been happening is bubbling away in the background, going back to the early 70s. Some of the activists were frustrated at the pace of change. And this kind of led to a kind of cultural Marxist attitude, which very crudely divides the world into oppressed and oppressor. And it kind of stuck in the universities. It's not a particularly big deal, but it bubbles away. And this morphs into the modern form of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so particularly post-George Floyd, companies have a mad scramble. They think we're under huge pressure to do something about this. And they want to do the right things, and they want to be seen to do the right things. And they reach for what's available on the shelf, and it's this diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. And they roll it out across our biggest companies, institutions around the world. But what they don't realize is they're not rolling out just a nice HR manual which says, treat everyone fairly, don't discriminate, let's all get on with each other, and make sure that people aren't being sexist or racist, and let's try and recruit sensibly. What they're rolling out is this kind of cultural Marxist-inspired, ideologically driven program that's been bubbling away since the 70s, with its the world as oppressed and oppressor. If you're white and male, you are an oppressor. And as a result of that, the companies, our biggest capitalist institutions, have rolled out this kind of very divisive program, DEI, and the effects that it have aren't good for men, they're not good for women, and they're not good for people of colour because they backfire. We can get into that. But broadly, it's this sense of having to, you see quotas coming in overnight, and you see things like Whiteness Training rolled out. And it also ushers in a culture where men in particular, as we'll see, are very, very scared to speak out. It's the world of microaggressions. It's a world of you can't challenge this, you can't disagree with things, you can't speak freely. And it's had quite a chilling impact on free speech. It's certainly affected meritocracy, and I think it's had a huge impact on men, as the polling that we've done shows. But you can't talk about this without being labelled as a crazy, as a racist or a right-wing loony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a time when standing up against discrimination was a noble thing, as you described there. But it seems to be quite a different thing, and you've come under some scrutiny for that.
Yes, and I would say that I've made a career of standing up against discrimination. When I was at Newsnight, I worked undercover in Belfast in a real IRA area to expose the rising Islamophobia at the time, and pretended to be an Afghan kebab worker, and was abused and spat at on camera. And I was Race and the Media Journalist in the Year. I won another Royal Television Society Award for my anti-racism work. More recently for Nat Geo in the States, I was trying to expose why so many black people were living next to toxic dumps in Alabama. So, as a journalist, I've always been motivated to expose unfairness, discrimination, waste of public money. And for me, all that's just really valid when addressing DEI, but it isn't seen that way.
Yeah. Can you tell me about Whiteness Training? Now, a quick interruption from our sponsor, Ground News. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website help me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any news story. Let's take a quick example. How the media is covering Trump's new travel ban. Left-leaning The Intercept ran the headline, Trump travel ban punishes victims of the US war machine. Now let's turn to Ground News to see how the rest of the media is covering this story. There are over 415 published on Trump's new travel ban, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and a breakdown of key information. Meanwhile, right-leaning The Blaze ran the headline, Trump announces total ban on travel from 12 countries. Just focusing on the key information, which is a very different narrative from The Intercept. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential for making informed decisions and spotting media bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. But back to the interview.
Yes, it goes back to this basic paradigm of oppressed and oppressor. And I've seen a training course that clinical psychologists for the NHS were taught. So it's, these are people who are doing 3-year doctorates to become our next generation of therapists. And I spoke to a guy who'd been on the course, and we had to interview him anonymously because, like a lot of the guys in the series, they know you can't speak out about this without huge repercussions. And he shared with me the training manual, and it was talking about whiteness as this kind of oppressive, dominant worldview where white people are out to kind of grab and retain power. They do so blindly, and it's unwitting. And twice in this material, it uses the word eugenics, which for me is kind of staggering. Eugenics, as we know, is a sort of fascist favourite of trying to breed the master race. And I couldn't believe that in this training manual that NHS therapists were seeing, it refers to eugenics not once but twice.
Wait, sorry, in what context were they using that term?
It just sort of had words, phrases associated with whiteness, and almost some of those sort of thought bubbles. But I was just astonished that a word like that could make it into there. And I spoke to this guy he'd sat through this training, and he said, afterwards, he felt that he couldn't speak out. People would say to him, "Look, we don't want to hear your male opinion. We don't want to hear your white opinion." And the whole world of therapy was now being seen, he said, through this need to rectify power. So if you're suffering psychologically, it's because you don't have power. It's all about redressing power, which from a therapeutic point of view, as someone that's had plenty over the years, it's a really bizarre way to look at mental health. Yeah, maybe it's a factor, let's not deny that. But there are so many other factors which affect your mental health. It's not just about redressing power. But he just said this NHS training course had been so politicized and so captured by this dogma, it had become obsessed with restoring power rather than just really pragmatically taking a step back and saying, if someone's seeing you and they're not well, look at them as individuals. What's the evidence-based treatment that's going to help them, rather than this very crude lens in which to see the world?
Yeah, so the power thing is actually crucial, because that is absolutely neo-Marxist language. And you mentioned Marx earlier as the sort of forerunner, perhaps, of this. And it's neo-Marxist in the sense that where Marxism was all about economic classes, when that didn't work, or when some of those Marxists realized that was not working, they repackaged it along identitarian lines, which is why it's so curious in Britain, because it's lumping people as black and white, and that's not. And it's even more curious in America, the black and white, because it's not exactly how normal people see themselves. So, for example, in America, you might see yourself as Italian or Irish American or Jewish American. Identity is sure, but the white-black thing is quite specific to a worldview. And the power thing is crucial because it's the neo-Marxists think that power is the ultimate force at play that governs everything, ignoring competence, ignoring hard work, work ethic, and all these other things. You think
and it ignores class. So, I mean, for me, it's insane that you're looking at giving people a fair chance and you're ignoring class. So white working class lads, as we know, consistently underperform. They are the cohort at the bottom in education. But that doesn't get a look in when it comes to DEI, because they're white and male, whereas in fact they are hugely underperforming. Ageism really barely gets a look in as well. So you can discriminate. Half the courses don't even mention age, despite the fact that for people over 50, there's quite rampant ageism at work, because things just don't fit into this kind of very neat. The world is messy, it's complicated, it's nuanced, but they're trying to see everything through this very dogmatic prism of power. And as a result of that, I don't think you're helping anyone. And there was a therapist, Dr. Carol Sherwood, I spoke to, who just said, from a therapeutic point of view, it doesn't help people to say, you're victims. Imagine you go to a therapist and you say, "Oh, I'm not feeling great this week," and they say, "Well, Winston, you're a victim." It's like it's not great therapy.
Mm. So, why do you think it was so successful then? Why you George Floyd, obviously that period 5 years ago, sort of turbocharged a lot of things that were going on, and what were the forces that meant that this, and I want to get into how DEI has captured not just the public sector, but the private sector. Of course, in America, on January 20th, Trump put an executive order immediately outlawing it. I think certainly
on the federal level,
in the States. And it not been the same story here in Britain. I'd like to get into
not
the differences.
At all, no.
But before we do that, why was this ideology so successful?
I think there was a moment, there was an opportunity that DEI grabbed. And I think, to be fair to companies, they were desperate to do something. And I think some of it clearly came from a good place. You look at what happened to George Floyd and, some of those other cases before it. And it's hard not to be outraged. And you've got your workers and you've got your customers saying, we need to do something. Actually, we do need to do something. Of course, we want to stamp out racism and sexism. Of course we do. And what's available? DEI. And so you bring it in. But what's interesting is that these CEOs, they know their way around a spreadsheet. They know when things work, they know to look for evidence. But when you look at the evidence for these programs, it's not just lacking, it's counterproductive. So Professor Frank Dobbin at Harvard University, a sociologist, and Alexandra Kelev, his colleague in Tel Aviv, crunched the data. They looked at a set of 8 million workers, and they found that when people have been through these schemes, they are actually counterproductive. They don't help women, and they don't help people from minority backgrounds. And it goes back to that divisiveness. And one of the big reasons why they don't work is that, lo and behold, you tell a bunch of white guys, oh, by the way, you're all implicitly racist and you're all privileged. The reaction is when someone says you're racist, you don't say, oh, God, that's an amazing point. Who'd have never thought of that? Of course I'm racist. You think, well, F you. Who are you to tell me I'm racist? So there's a backlash. So the schemes don't work. But companies, as Professor Dobbin said, they don't really look under the rock. They've got a problem.
Yeah.
They want to fix it. They reach for what they think is the solution, and it isn't. And they don't look at the data, despite being people whose careers are no doubt data. They don't look at the data, and they don't see that it is counterproductive. So I think there was a moment, there was an opportunity, there was a panic, there was a naivety, and there was a sense that what they were bringing in would fix a problem, through well-meaning intentions, but it's actually made things worse.
So it seems to me that CEOs might have been also in a bind where, although their number one responsibility is to deliver profit and return, they also have a responsibility. Well, actually, no, I don't know if it's a responsibility, but they probably want to do everything they can to avoid any sort of bad publicity. So if they ran afoul of this and they didn't join in, they might get accused of racism, and they kind of want to avoid it. I think this is one of the ways in which this ideology was very effective, is that they mastered the media. So if you didn't go along with it, you could be accused of racism.
In the same way that I sit here releasing White Men Can't Work with a sense of trepidation, because to question anything is to automatically be labelled as racist or far right or anything like that. So I think the CEOs were in a panic. I think there was a panic. Things move so quickly. Social media pressure builds so quickly. We had things like Lego pulled adverts that had policemen in them after George Floyd. I mean, there was a kind of a depth. There was a depth of panic to this, that companies just didn't want to be seen to do anything that might be seen as racist. Yeah, Lego policemen were pulled off air. L'Oreal was posting, I don't know, something like diversity is worth it. There was almost a bidding war, of Apple rolled out $100 million for its diversity schemes. Then somebody else 400 million, and Bank of America went up to 1 billion. It was like there was a kind of corporate panic. And also, I imagine quite a lot of these CEOs were white or white male and felt they weren't on strong grounds to say, actually, I'm not sure about any of this. You just think, the winds were so intense at the time. And as I said, I'm not denying that there were good intentions behind this. I just think that what people reached for unwittingly was incredibly divisive and wasn't what they thought they were going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And when you and why check the data, because it's not going to give you the answer that you want.
Yes.
But it's there, and it's still very much part of the HR fabric as well.
Even in America, or
America's interesting. So on a federal level, it's toast. But a lot of individual companies, like Apple and others, have doubled down and say we're still keeping this. What's also interesting is there's been a rebranding. So DEI has become a bit of a toxic term. So some people call it belonging, some call it inclusion, some call it belonging and inclusion. It's been rebranded, but it's essentially the same. And when you have an industry which is it's estimated to be around $14 billion a year, that industry,
the DEI industry,
yeah,
is worth $14 billion.
Yeah, it's between sort of $10 and $20 billion a year, last available data.
Wait, so who's spending what money and who's getting it?
So big companies are rolling out programs. They bring in consultants to roll out those programs. And if you think of how many companies now have DEI policies and programs globally, it's a huge industry. And so when you have a multi-billion-dollar industry, it doesn't just die. It desperately tries to reinvent itself. And there's a fascinating Professor Professor Eric Smith at the Cato Institute, a black guy who likes to call out lazy assumptions on race. And, he said, if your job depends on finding racism, you're going to find it. So I think there are a lot of people who are employed by this, who are making a living from this, who are reinventing, who are doubling down. And HR departments, this has become part of the fabric now. And, and the messy thing is, this stuff does need addressing. I'm not saying there isn't discrimination. I'm not saying there isn't sexism. I'm not saying that it doesn't need addressing. Of course it does. It's just been addressed in a really, really bad way. And as Professor Dobbin at Harvard has showed, there are ways to address this, but they're just not sexy overnight quotas or PR press releases that you can drop out. You need to target kids from minority backgrounds or underprivileged backgrounds when they're as young as 13 or 14. Support them through school, give them work experience, mentor them once they join workforces, give them extra skills training, have employee referral programs. All this stuff works. All this stuff addresses the root discriminations out there, but it takes time, and it's not a splashy press release. Interestingly, the US Army do a good job of this, where they target kids, they support them, they offer that extra training, they mentor, but they don't lower standards. So no one can be accused of, well, you've only gotten here because you're a DEI hire, which is a problem. And I've heard that from a lot of women and some black people, which is you've now created this label of DEI hire, which makes people feel that their successes aren't real, and it makes them paranoid. So you can do all this without lowering or dropping standards. But when you overnight announce a quota, you're setting people up for failure. You're setting people up to be accused of DEI hires, and you're not supporting them. So people get jobs and they often flame out because they're not qualified for them, or they don't like there's a terrible feeling am I doing my job because I'm capable of this, or have I just been picked to fill a quota? And, Professor Alex Edmonds at London Business School said he was approached to be on some boards, and they said, well, we just need more ethnic people on the boards. And he said, that's incredibly insulting. I don't want to be on a board because of that. Pick me because of my skills, not because you're ticking a box.
Yeah, it is racist itself. And I just on training again, if I may. I remember 2017, 2018, 2019 reading a lot of the literature of the anti-racist writers. So Patrice Cairn-Collars, the founder of Black Lives Matter, for example, Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I remember coming out of, because I wanted to understand what this movement was. And reading all that literature, I maybe read 20 odd books on it or something. I came out, it possibly made me more racist, because in the sense that I was now observing race where I wasn't before. I was now seeing people in a racial way when I hadn't before. It completely corrupted me. I think it's in that sense. I wondered if is there evidence that anti-racism training works? Is there any evidence that it can actually, you can be deracialized? Because for me, it seems to be a reverse. My personal experience was it was a reverse. I had to run away from that literature for a little bit to just get back to normal.
Well, I think the strongest evidence is that it doesn't work because it makes things worse, because there's a backlash. And
right.
The professors I mentioned, Dobbin and Kalev, looked at more than 1,000 psychological studies. As I said, 8 million people who'd been on this training, and it creates a backlash.
The backlash being that people resent, the people doing the training resent that they're
that you go on a training course and you're told you have unconscious racism. Let me tell you why you're racist. You just don't know it. That's not a great way of. If that person was racist, it's not a great way of dealing with it. And if they're not racist, it's not a great way to win them over. I think, and talking to Dr. Dina McMillan, who runs a black clinical social psychologist, who runs training, and she said we have to stress commonalities. So when she goes into companies, she said it can be as like, let's build like, who likes, I don't know, Motown, who likes this, who likes that. Bring people together, get them to connect on a human level. So, the way in which, she argues things succeed is you build empathy. Yeah. So if you've got, I don't know, a black worker in your office, you get to know them, you empathize, think, oh, actually, maybe this is their background, this is what they've been through. I like them as a person. They can see you. Maybe you've had a different struggle yourself, or you've got mental health issues. You connect people, you build empathy. And then you might think, oh, I don't like the way they're being treated, or I'm going to call someone out. That feels like bullying. What doesn't work is to categorize and divide. It just goes against human nature.
Yeah. I wondered if we could look at, again, before we get more into examples, the lay of the land in terms of in what sectors DEI is operating. You've already mentioned the NHS, and I wanted to look at the church. I don't know if you've looked into it there, because I know there are DEI officers there. You mentioned the American Army, but I wanted to know what is going on with the British Army. In 2023, the RAF came under, I think they came under scrutiny for some sort of...
Yeah, so the RAF had set targets of women and minorities. And again, let's say for good reason. But to scramble to meet those targets, they were found to have overlooked white men, in the same way that Thames Valley Police came under the same scrutiny, where people had been over-promoted at the expense of white officers, which ended in a tribunal. And the RAF got rebuked and has since said that they have they were too hasty to roll out that quota. It's just that thing, Winston, of setting a number and going for that quick fix rather than saying, okay, this does need addressing, but it's going to take a bit of time to get there. And we're going to have to nurture a generation of people and support them through. I can't speak to the church. I don't know about that. I know whiteness training is still being rolled out with some police forces and in parts of the NHS. A number of companies in Britain have doubled down on this, and a vast majority of people surveyed by the Institute of Directors say that DEI is still in place. I think partly as a reaction, we look at Trump and he's not terribly popular over here, and we think, well, he can do that, but we're not doing that. We're different. So I think
So Trump might actually have made things worse for Britain in this domain.
potentially, I think, these things become so tribal, and it's very easy here to look at what he's doing and just think, well, that's, when he does land on something which might be valid, to still dismiss that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would say about the Trump thing, they've dismantled it. I don't like the fact that they're purging words from websites. That's extreme. And if you're going to dismantle it,
Sorry, what's Trump's doing? What?
they've been purging words, various federal websites. There are, I think, a few hundred words now which can't be used. Diversity words and that sort of thing. I just think it's dangerous to go after language.
Yes.
I don't think DEI is fit for purpose, but I think it needs to be replaced with something. This kind of longer term support to bring people through. But that's certainly not going to happen on a federal level. But yeah, no, here it's still very much alive and kicking, and not something that you can really question.
Yeah. So have you got any insight into what's DEI measures in the police forces?
What's interesting is you have the specifics of trying to promote people and make get women and people from minority backgrounds into more senior positions. But what's interesting is talking to, in one of our episodes, we speak to a guy who was a special policeman and used to go out and, Saturday night and deal with stuff. And he said that the culture of policing has been affected. He said that's where he most acutely felt it. So he became very aware that the biggest threat to his career was doing or saying the wrong thing. And one night he was out policing in a market town, and he saw someone commit a minor assault. And he said lots of people are out, lots of people have their phones. And normally he would have given chase. He's a white guy. The suspect was black. And he said in that moment, he hesitated. He thought, I could go after the guy, but everyone's going to film it. And it's just a bad look. He's a big white guy running after a black guy to try and bring him down. And he said in that moment, he hesitated and he just thought, I don't want to do that. And he said, post Black Lives Matter, there'd been a sort of cultural shift in the police force, and he's now quit. He just said he thought he'd end up getting hauled up for something, and that would just damage him and his reputation and his family. So he quit. We've spoken to firemen as well. So again, anonymously. So a female firefighter got in touch. And just a caveat, just to go back, like the police force and the fire service over the years, have had some really bad race issues. There's been some shocking stuff here. Obviously, George Floyd in America. So it needed dealing with, and that goes without saying. I guess I'm just sort of reporting on what some of the people in those forces are saying the impact has been. And in the fire service, what's interesting is there's a sort of dark humour that pervades the emergency services. You've just done something horrific, you come back, you make a joke, and they say, people say it kind of clears the air, and there's a lot of banter going on. Some of it probably, no doubt, was excessive and needed to stop. But what some of the fire guys were saying is people keep themselves more. They used to hang out in the rec room and chat a lot more and have a bit of bonhomie. People keep themselves more because they're just worried they're going to say the wrong thing, and that's going to be it for their career. A female firefighter got in touch. She said, I can see how it's really hard for male firefighters at the moment. They're not getting the promotions. Some of the fire brigades lowered their entry standards in terms of the kind of physicality of the weights that you can lift. And this fireman said to me, look, I have no problem. I work with some brilliant female firefighters. But they've lowered the standards now to get more women in. But he said the net result is you've got a load of fat guys now who aren't up to the physical standards. And And he said there's a kind of safetyism as well now, because you go as fast as the slowest person in the team. And he said they got to a school fire. And normally they would have got there in time to be able to deal with it. He said we got there, and by the time the slowest person had caught up, the school had burnt down. So I don't know. Listen, anecdotal. There was some really horrible sexism and racism in our emergency services that had to be stamped out. George Floyd was horrific. But people are saying, I guess it's about pendulum. There's a sense in which it swung too far, and that it might be affecting people's ability to do their jobs.
I think it seems to me there's like a few things that's been conflated there, if I can try and unpick it. Firstly, there's the question of DEI hiring, so hiring people on different identities for the sake of having different identities represented rather than anything else. Then there's the cultural aspect, which you sort of described there, sort of a fear of speaking about whether or not, a fear even to go after perpetrators. The most famous example of that culturally in Britain is the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, where a security guard admitted that he didn't want to approach Salman Abedi, the killer, because he saw him before with the backpack and didn't do it because he didn't want to be called racist, right? So that'd be an example of the cultural aspect, which is I'd say downstream of DEI. And then the other thing is whether or not these institutions are actually racist, because DEI, like hiring people of more ethnicities or whatever, would not be a solution for the problem of racism existing, whether or not it exists in these institutions and to what level it exists in these institutions. That's almost like a separate issue, right? So do you think I'm right in paring those three things apart?
And I think one of the most interesting issues is around self-censorship. So we polled with JL partners, white men across the UK, and found that nearly half of all white men are self-censoring at work. They are too afraid to give honest but respectful feedback to a colleague or make a joke. The knock-on effect of that is a third of guys say that their mental health is suffering because of anxiety, that they could lose their jobs over doing or saying the wrong thing.
Yes, but that's a separate thing, right? Because that's not DEI hiring.
It's not DEI hiring. No, it's not.
That's a culture of...
It's the culture that has come hand in hand with DEI and some of the training that takes place, and we live in a much more offence aware culture as well. So it's not, one thing is the hiring practice, another thing is the training, but the knock-on effect, there's a kind of just a wider culture in which people don't speak freely, and again, in the era of the 70s, it's sort of bottom slapping, sexism, all that had to go. Not denying that. And it's good, sometimes you should think twice before just blurting out what's in your mind, because you don't want to bully someone by mistake or say the wrong thing or did the wrong thing. But it's quite something when guys are saying, I sit in meetings and I daren't raise my hand to give a valid point because I don't want to be seen as a sort of dominant white male. Or that, going back to your previous point, academia is a place where this stuff is really at its most pervasive. And there was an academic I spoke to who was kind of questioning the way in which certain things were being taught. He had a sense that the department didn't really like him for questioning some of their values, and they started to build microaggression cases against him. So they got together a series of microaggressions, alleged microaggressions, including when he was talking about a projector, he said, he talked about the male and female ends of cables, which, you know your way around a cable. That's what they're called. You go on Amazon, it's male and female cables. That was used as one of the reasons to sack him from his job, which is just astonishing. A job, he'd come from a challenging background, had worked his way up there, hadn't been to university himself, got a job in academia, and then is pushed out over things like, can you pass me the female end of that cable, the male end of that cable, which is insane. So there's a when you hear stories like this, it's no wonder so many guys are on edge about what they could do or say, especially in places like academia, that could cost them their jobs. You know, there is a profound lack of humanity and just common sense that has been wiped out through this culture. And the guy now, you know, ended up on antidepressants. And so many of the people I spoke to have ended up with depression or anxiety because you know, he said the university was saying to him, we don't think your values fit with being able to stand in front of young people and teach them. How can I not take that personally?
Wow. Do you think that we might be past the peak of this sort of mania? Are we, in Britain specifically? Obviously in America, it's the case that the pushback is loud and proud, whether or not it's actually completely wiped out the DEI mentality. But in Britain, even though it's much worse than America, a lot of people we're past the point where everyone's afraid to speak out because a lot of people are speaking out against it.
I think it depends what sector you're in. I think if you're in academia, it's probably still at the peak or, I don't know, ascending the mountain.
Oof.
I think if I'd have put White Men Can't Work Out, let's say, a couple of years ago, I would have been even more under the cosh for it. I think there is a bit of a recognition now that maybe we've overcooked this, that maybe the pendulum has swung too far, but multi-billion-dollar industry doesn't just disappear. You know, I think, people like West Streeting has come out and said, the health service needs to rein this in a bit. I think there is a recognition that it has swung too far, but I don't think it's going to disappear overnight. I think it will rebrand. I think it will still be very much part of that HR ethos. And I also think there is a generation coming through of, and someone made the point to me, Edward Skidelsky at the Committee for Academic Freedom made the point that younger people, when polled, say it was right to cancel J.K. Rowling. Older people say it wasn't. So when you have a younger generation, coming through, who are open to cancellation, who don't perhaps value free speech as highly, who are of a generation where it's not okay to feel offended, then if they hold on to those values, it's an if, because we all change our values as we get older, if they hold on to those values, then you could see this stuff perpetuating more as they get into positions of power.
I think there's some evidence also against that, which is that the generation even younger than them, i.e. the ones who are 18 to 22 at this point, are kind of rebelling against the woke generation. And you can see that a little bit in the political voting. And you see Reform, for example, UK was the right-wing populist insurgent party who did well at the 2024 elections in the male young demographic.
Yes, I mean, it's a point I've been trying to make for a long time. I mean, I was doing a lot of reporting in America and wrote an op-ed for the New York Times when Trump was really nowhere in 2016 about why I think he was going to cruise home on the male vote, because of the particular appeal to blue-collar men. And the New York Times didn't publish it. And for me, it was glaringly obvious that there's an appeal of the right or populism globally amongst disenfranchised men. Because when a guy loses his job, or that job was vulnerable, it affects not just his living, but his complete identity as a male, his self-esteem. He's kind of this kind of core hunter-gathering that was, the book I wrote was called Who Stole My Spear? I kind of have a sense that we are still, cavemen in suits, certainly wired that way. And you have this profound sense of loss. And loss is an incredibly interesting emotion. It's twice as powerful as anything positive. So when you lose, the things which certainly keep me awake at night, it's like I've lost something and I want to get it back. When you see gamblers chasing their losses, you lose your mind to kind of to overturn that. And so, look, men who've lost their jobs, I said they've lost their identity, they might have lost their relationships, they've lost money, there's so much loss associated with that when someone comes along and says, I'm going to restore those losses, you're going to think, well, okay, I might not like his views on immigration, I might not love some of the things he's done, but if he can fix my losses, I'm going to go with him. And DEI, I think, feeds further into that, because it's saying to men, you can do or say the one wrong thing at work and you will lose everything. And in some cases, men have lost their jobs because they're men. And, the first show is about 5 guys at ad agencies who got sacked because they're men and won the tribunal. So when this sense of loss that's out there, I just think it's absolutely ripe for people to come along and offer simple solutions, by and large populists. And the point I would say, and I tried to pitch this to The Guardian, but they're not particularly biting, which is, if you don't want more Brexit, Trump, reform, Bolsonaro, Orban, all the things that you don't like, they're all majority male. You have to understand what's going on with men. You have to engage with them. You have to some degree of sympathy and empathy for men, or they're going to drift off to places you don't like. And I have no doubt that the male reform vote will grow and grow and grow. And I think reform will become increasingly attractive to men who feel that they are on the back foot. And I think Labour and the Lib Dems and the Tories need to recognise this if they want to stop that.
My pushback here would be, it's not totally evident to me that it's the men who are drifting, although there are definitely pockets who are, and at the extremes, people like Andrew Tate, I think, would be an example of drifting, where I don't necessarily think reform is drifting. I think it's pretty common sense, a lot of it. I would say it's actually, and the FT did a report on this, but it looks like women are the ones who are drifting harder to the left. And so all these institutions, including the Conservative Party, have drifted left. A lot of this DEI crap happened under the Conservative Party. And one of which is quite striking, and is in the House of Commons, they have a inclusion and diversity strategy that was brought in 2023. It's sort of 4-year strategy. And they want to decrease the pay gap. So this is institutions, even those that claim to have been conservative, that have all drifted left to me. It seems like.
Yes.
Do you think I'm wrong to think that?
Well, I think you can have a strategy, but it's if you having a strategy to take on racism and sexism, if it's in whatever forms it's there, isn't a bad way. But it's how you have that strategy. If that strategy is rooted in evidence and what works and is pragmatic and isn't divisive and isn't there to demonize men, then it's not such a bad thing. But when that strategy is co-opted by this radical identity based ideology, then it's a terrible thing. It's interesting. I mean, I think the Democrats were the blue collar party and they've lost their men. And when you look at the internal divisions that they have and that kind of squad wing and that kind of like trying to drag people to the left, it's just insanity. For the Democrats to ever, challenge again, they need to recognize they've lost blue collar males and what's going on in the head of these guys. What is it that has allowed them to, go to Trump? How have they lost, these people? And they just need to, partly it's economic, and as a result of America joining the allowing China to join the World Trade Organization, there's about 3 million manufacturing jobs have disappeared to China. That has a huge impact. It's 3 million guys and their families and their communities and the psychological toll of that and the opioids and the alcohol. We don't think about the human consequences, and I just think people need to, and I've been to a lot of these places in the Rust Belt, and they're hollowed out.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder people are desperate.
Yes. I mean, absolutely. It's kind of been, so the point you're making is it's not just DEI, but there's a whole bunch of things that have really affected.
I think there's a wider failure. I think there's a blind spot that the left or liberals have towards men. Everyone's so focused on everyone else. And, I've had this, a lot of the times when I've pitched programs or, articles to liberal media, I've been hit with the response of, come on, what have men got to complain about? And it's so bogus because, there are guys at the top who are way overrepresented and have a really nice, cushy life. But for a lot of men out there, it's a really hard time. In America, 50% of families living paycheck to paycheck. It's a really difficult economy. And if you look at men's mental health rates, it's absolutely dire. You look at we all know suicide's the biggest killer of men under 45. Alcohol rates, self-abuse rates, homeless rates, incarceration rates, all hugely skewing male.
Do we have a sense of how much those rates have changed in over the last sort of 50 years, and whether is there any way we can see a correlation with DEI? It's probably quite hard to actually...
I don't think you can correlate DEI, but you can certainly correlate the economy. So after the 2008 recession, there was a spike of 10,000 male suicides across North America and Europe. Our worth, our identities are so toxically linked to our jobs, and when they get taken away, it's a very, very hard thing for men to deal with. I mean, there was a guy anonymously who got in touch with me who said that he just couldn't find work and was told, we don't want to hire men, and he said he thought about taking his own life, but thankfully he was talked out of it. The guys who've all been lost their jobs because of this have certainly all slipped into some really quite bad depression. There's a guy lovely guy who in our first show worked for a big ad agency and won the top awards. He did some brilliant ads, including this sort of late 90s Tango advert, which was bonkers and brilliant. It won all the top awards, and he was at a big agency, and the agency realized it had a problem with pay gap, and Me Too happened, and they said there was it was sort of too white and male, the agency, and he said it never really was. It was always works on very diverse teams. So he and 4 colleagues wrote to HR and said, this doesn't sound great for us. Like you're saying, you've got too many white men, we're white men. And within a week, all 5 had been sacked. And he was like, okay, have we just been sacked for men? So they went to an employment lawyer, and he said he felt very queasy about this, as a white man saying I've been sacked for sex discrimination. But they went to court, they went to a tribunal, and they won. And the judge ruled that they had been sacked because they were men, and it never would have happened to a woman. Meanwhile, the social media mob pile on this guy who's, accuse him of all sorts. He's Christian, and someone even wrote to his local church in North London and said that this guy was going against Christian values, and how dare he be a member of your congregation. I mean, it's
wow.
It's vicious. It's insane. And he's now moved to the other side of the world. And when I spoke to him, he said he still physically shakes from the trauma. Poor guy, brilliant guy, but there's no humanity out there. So yeah, it's
staggering.
Yeah, we need empathy. We need empathy for women. We need empathy for people from minorities. We need empathy for men.
We've touched on when DEI hits the legal and the Equality Act in 2010 does protect people on, amongst other things, gender and sex, or I should say sex. And so it's interesting that this play between, to me, the Equality Act and DEI, because on the one hand, you have parties and people in position pushing DEI, or they had been. Certainly, Labour had been. Maybe that you mentioned Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, is now perhaps edging off it a little bit. But it's still the case that the Equality Act persists, and it was I actually don't entirely know the history of the Equality Act, but one would think that it come from the idea of pushing equality. At the same time, you have this DEI. So what's the relationship then, do you think, between them?
It's really tricky. So there's an employment lawyer called Adrian Scotland I spoke to, who said companies, you can't give someone a job just because they're a woman instead of a man. But where two people are equally qualified for that job, you can, diversity is something that can be taken into account. But he said in reality, it's never the case that two people are exactly equal. But he said, the reality is there are companies who are breaking the law. They might well know that they are breaking the law, but because they are so ideologically committed to this and they see that what they're doing is a good thing, that they are overcoming this kind of ingrained injustice, that they're willing to flout the law. It's hard to prove, but he said since the case of the ad guys, he's had others who have come forward. It is hard to prove, but he's no doubt that men's legal protections are being sort of ridden over by companies who think they know better than the law, was his sense.
I wondered if we might look at some of the left-wing critiques of this. So The Guardian, as I've mentioned, wrote a piece criticising you. This is Gabby Hinsliff, a columnist, and she finishes by saying, so if white men generally don't think work is working for them, welcome to the club, boys. Just don't forget that some of us have been here for rather a long time. And the basic argument is that actually women and minorities earn less still and feel like they also feel like a sense of racism, perhaps, in the ways that you might have described self-censorship. There's other plays going on here. And this seems to be there seems to be a cherry picking of facts to support arguments on either side. I might add. So, for example, she writes, men still out-earn women by 7% on average, and the unemployment rate for black men is more than twice that of white men. But if you sort of look into this, and the best argument against this that I found is by Warren Farrell, who wrote in 2005 a book, Why Men Earn More, and the startling truth behind the pay gap and what women can do about it. And he lists 25 reasons why men might earn more than women, and they include different fields that, if you're in STEM or this finance, you might earn more. And that's not just because, women don't necessarily choose those industries. There might be individual women who do choose those industries, but at the aggregate level, women tend to prefer care or tend to prefer other industries which earn less by the market. Now, where do you stand on this sort of line of thought?
So it's interesting. My figures might be out of date, but in Who Stole My Spear, I took this on and I said, the reality in this country is that women out-earn men predominantly in their 20s and 30s. Women do better at university, more women are going to university now.
Yeah.
Where things go pear-shaped is after having children, where more women end up going part-time or taking on the burden of childcare. So the problem isn't a sort of root sexism because women are out-earning men until that point. The problem is...
Well, it might be sexism the other way. Possibly.
Yeah,
I'm not going to, but...
Yeah. The challenge is what happens after childcare. So the way to address that would be to, I guess, support women more coming back to their careers, having better quality childcare in this country, and why not offer paternity care as well, paternity leave that is of Scandinavian proportions for those that want it. Whatever supports a family, it's hard work and it's really expensive having kids. So whatever supports people to not get in the way of their career, that's the reality. That's where the pay gap comes from. It comes from our failure or the reality of children, having children. It doesn't come from sexism at that point. And, and it will also, women returning to their jobs, after having brought up children will also be an issue. So that's where it is. So yeah, it's messy, the pay gap, but it's a problem around childcare. It's not sexism. So to say, yeah, men out-earn women, yeah, that's because of childcare. And yeah, we do need to address that. But it's slightly bogus to say we have a pay gap issue without looking at childcare.
Yeah, quite. I mean, if a woman takes off a period of time to be a mother, and to right she should, and they choose to, because it's mother. I mean, I can't think of a greater thing than being a mother. It's just a total wonder.
Yeah.
Not that I intend to pursue mothership, but
is this your transitioning announcement? Breaking news.
This show is transitioning into quite a different. But if, let's say, a woman takes 5 years off or however long, she comes back, and a man doing the same job at the same time, they'll have done 5 years extra work, so they'll advance through their career. So the woman will be at a different position to where she came, as is natural progression in a career. That's just one example where it changes things massively. Yeah. And it's also a thing that on the men might prefer to do more overtime, and so that would skew. Overtime paid more, so it might skew the average. And
yeah, I mean the reality is it's complicated. But I guess in terms of the left wing critique, welcome to our club, boys. I just think that's so reductive. It's not you're a victim, so welcome. It's actually, well, why do we want to create more victims? Why do we want men to now feel discriminated against? Why do we want men's mental health to be affected? Why do we want, as the survey showed, people to be profoundly worried about bringing up boys into a world where, white boys going to be denied opportunities. It's, educationally, I prefer to think we can lift everyone up rather than welcome to the kind of victims club. So, I would have preferred they just, it's so easy to kind of say, oh, welcome. Like, why don't you engage with the issue and say, why are we making men feel worse through policies that don't help women or people of colour? I mean, it's...
There's another way in which it hurts women, which that these identitarian lines are actually arbitrary, in the sense that, in the same way that they shifted from the class to the sort of race lines or gender lines, but it sort of assumes that these men don't have wives. And so it's also the case that women spend more than men. So women, in a sense, control the markets. You can argue that significantly more than men. But these men are married to women, and their earnings are spent by their family. They don't spend them necessarily on themselves. So this left-wing ideology, for me, it splits men and women as if they're in separate groups and separate communities that aren't linked. No, they're absolutely
and most people I know, including myself, you're a unit with your wife or husband.
Yes.
Fighting the world, trying to stay afloat in a horrible economy where everything costs too much. And when my wife comes back and says she's got a pay rise, it's hallelujah. I mean, it's like, it's like, thank God she has a proper job.
Yeah. No, you're doing important work. So then tell me about what you're hoping to achieve with White Men Can't Work.
Well, for me, it's a sort of point of journalism. Is you want to expose something which isn't working. You want to give voice to those who feel marginalised. And as bonkers as it sounds, there are a myriad of blokes who feel that they can't speak out on this.
Yeah,
and it doesn't help anyone. So what I would love to achieve is for this to be a really honest conversation about, okay, companies have rushed out these policies for understandable reasons. They perhaps didn't realise what they were getting into bed with. What can they do now instead? Can they pivot towards programs which are evidence-based, which bring people together, which don't demonise men? Can they look at what, can they be more open to free speech? Can people speak freely now? Can we not have this kind of crazy self-censorship that's there, that dehumanizes people, that takes, people aren't walking around with warmth towards their colleagues. They're seeing people as hostile, and just to bring a bit more sort of sense to this whole issue. You know, it's so ideological and it's just not working, and we're spending a fortune on this. You know, I found an NHS job that was being advertised for a DEI person, which paid up to £139,000 a year. It's
as in like a DEI officer.
Yeah.
Their job is to overlook everyone.
To help roll out DEI programs for 139. You know, you can get multiple nurses for that. You know, there's just a sort of
that's astonishing.
If you taken place.
I think the opening salary for a junior doctor is something like 35 grand or 38 grand. It's pretty damn low.
I don't know, but you can certainly get a lot of healthcare assistance for 139 grand. And when I spoke to Professor Carol Sikora, an oncologist, he was saying, you know, and the problem is, it's not just draining money, but these people are sitting there thinking, what can I do? And what can I do for this? They're just going to put more burden on people who are just trying to get on and do their day jobs in the NHS. You know, he said he has to go on diversity training, and they watch a video, and there's I think a black person sat on a park bench, and white people are throwing beer cans at him or her, and they have to discuss it. And he said it's like they're trying to put everything through this racial lens, when it's just like it's antisocial behaviour throwing a beer can at anyone. And he said, I have to sit here and go on this, and I'm doing this, and I'm not dealing with patients. Like, there are certain areas that do need to address it. You know, for example, some of the studies show that doctors, for some reason, seem to not take pain as seriously amongst black women. For some reason, they're seen as having a greater pain threshold. So when you have something specific like that, educate. Of course, you know, it means.
Sorry, can you explain that to me?
Yeah, there are some studies which show that pain isn't taken as seriously amongst black women as with white women.
Amongst blacks, women, or
doctors don't. The medical profession don't take pain as seriously when black women present with it. I don't know why. And let's say,
is it creditable?
Yeah, it seems to be, but I don't know why. And let's say, maybe there is some unconscious bias that has crept in there. Then deal with that. Make sure that there are protocols in place to make sure there is training in place. But don't tell all doctors carte blanche, you're all implicitly racist.
Yeah.
That isn't a sensible way of doing these things.
I know you've made the case that things are much worse here in Britain, but I think it might be worth pointing to some of the anti-DEI. So the Bank of England said in March 2025 they were scrapping the rule that 42,000 businesses had to report their diversity.
Yeah, that was a big announcement. Yeah,
it's a big announcement. It's also the case that I think Goldman Sachs have said they're scrapping their DEI.
Some of these companies which are America-facing have pulled back on it.
Right, so it's the influence from the States
I think
that's
so,
come
yeah.
over.
Yeah.
Although that doesn't really apply to the Bank of England, does it?
No, but I just think they could see they were going to get bogged. I don't know, but they're going to get bogged down in the political waters on this, maybe.
Right. BT as well this year have announced something similar. And it's also the case that after Reform had their very successful local council elections last month, one of the things they kept hammering was that they were going to get rid of all the DEI officers at the council level. You talked about how much we're spending, obviously. Do you have a sense of how much the government is spending on?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Okay. But it seems that there's definitely the case, and I've looked into it in the church, that there's a lot of money spent on these DEI officers, which...
Yes, and it would be interesting to see what rebranding's taking place, and also how much of it just nestles in HR now.
What do you mean?
But the rebranding where it's no longer DEI, it's just...
Oh, they just find a new term?
Brand, as I said, like some have become inclusion, some's belonging, some is inclusion, belonging, and how much of it is now just HR.
And when you say it's just HR, so what do you mean?
So, rather than bringing in diversity training consultants, where the HR departments now just sort of run diversity courses.
Okay. Right. Well, it's kind of horrifying stuff. It's been very enlightening speaking with you. Is there anything that you'd like to add on this topic that you don't think we've covered?
I think the central message is there's just a better way of doing this. There's a smarter way of doing this. We need to take the ideology out of this. We need to be led by the data. It's not to deny that racism and sexism doesn't exist. It's to say that we can do this in smarter ways and not at the expense of men. Because I just think it's important that we have this debate, that people can speak out about. It's crazy that you can't talk freely about this without being on tenterhooks. I mean, I still feel a bit nervous talking about this because I know there's probably bits that could be clipped and taken out of context and make me look pretty extreme,
This is because you spent 20 years at the BBC.
I don't know. I'm just sort of hardwired to be a neutral journalist.
Yeah.
And I really value that. And I just think this is a piece of journalism that's important.
Yeah.
That's backed up by the data, but it's not going to be seen that way. Whereas you probably don't have that sort of.
I had it when I was in the music industry for a long time. And by the end of my time there, I was very scared to speak.
Yeah.
Lest exactly it be misused or you kind of worry about it. But that was 4 years out of it. I feel a bit different.
Okay.
I actually would say that you say about institutionalized racism. It sort of sounds like you're arguing that there is institutionalized racism and it's anti-male and that's obviously not racism. It's anti-white.
Yeah. I think the evidence would now seem to suggest that a lot of guys are saying they are facing discrimination because they're white men, and it's always it's hard to back that up, but it's a serious about when a third of young guys under 36% of guys under 34 are saying they've directly lost out on promotions or career opportunities because they're white and male. I think we've got to take that seriously. Some of them might just be nitwits who didn't deserve the job.
Yeah.
Some of them might be trying to blame others. But there's something going on out there, and that pendulum does need to swing back.
It does. I have a friend, an actor friend, who got a job as a role, was told, congratulations, you got the job, and then was later told, sorry, we actually need to have you haven't got the job anymore. We need to have a diversity hire. We need to have someone else. So, but again, it's not in writing. It's on the phone, so there's no evidence of it. But I suspect it is prevalent. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. We're going to carry on our conversation over on our Substack, winstonmarshall.co.uk, where we're going to talk about a very different topic, which is your experience as a journalist in Israel after October 7th. So I look forward to talking to you about that there. Thank you so much. And where can people find this? Is on YouTube?
Yeah, so it's a 5-part series. It's on YouTube. It's on, if you want to listen to it, it's on podcasts, Apple, Spotify. It's called White Men Can't Work. If you're struggling to find the links, go to timsamuels.com and they're all there. And we will put a link in the description. So if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be there, and we'll send appropriate links everywhere. Congratulations, and thank you so much for speaking with me. Thanks, Winston. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Tim Samuels. If you want to support this show, remember, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Tim exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk for an extended conversation with Tim about his experiences in Israel immediately after October 7th. He was there as a journalist. But until next time, be well.